How's it going, everybody? It's Gene here with Entropy and Sons, and today we're going to be doing a somewhat technical deep dive into the CV capabilities of our synth. So there's a lot of things you can do with the CV jacks on the back. You can render them directly to textures, you can turn them into waveforms and do stuff with that, and we're going to try to touch on all of these bases. So there's going to be quite a bit of information here. So first thing to know is that there are 8 jacks on the back, and that they are 0 to 10 volt. And if you tap on the CV configurator widget in the I/O tab, you can actually see the levels of what we have plugged in. So we have 2 LFO modules put through a scaling module. I think the LFO modules output plus or minus 5 volts, so the scaler gets them into the range that the synth needs. And then we have an XY controller over here. So LFO1 is for channels 1 and 3. I think it's a triangle wave and a sine wave. LFO2 is channels 2 and 4. And then X is channel 5, Y is channel 6. Another useful thing to know while you're on this page is that you can turn off a CV jack if you want to temporarily deactivate all the response to it, which is a handy thing to be able to do in some circumstances. So with that being said, let's get started. Alright, so the first thing to know is that there are generally 4 different types of ways you can integrate the CV data into the simulations on the synth. So first of all, there are 2 oscilloscope instruments, which are basically designed for visualizing CV and waveform data. The next thing you can do is you can render the CV inputs into textures, and you can use those textures in various points in various instruments, various simulations of the synth. You can also turn the CV inputs into waveforms in a couple of different ways and use those in various points in the various instruments. And the last thing you can do, which is definitely the most complicated, is you can directly map the CV controls to any of the numerical parameters on the synth. And there's some like 1 to 200 parameters in total, and they can all be mapped to CV in numerous ways. You can directly map the values, you can linearly scale and offset the values, you can use like gate controls, threshold controls, all kinds of stuff. And we'll try to get into all this. Alright, so the first thing we're going to get into today is Wavigrl, which is the 2D oscilloscope, which has been explicitly designed to visualize CV data. So we're basically just graphing the XY coordinates defined by the 2 LFO channels here. So you can speed them up and slow them down and see that it's reflected in what's happening here. It's fairly straightforward and largely what you would expect from an oscilloscope, but you do have access to some degree of control. So you can go into this module and, for instance, change the color of the waveform. You can change its size. You can change it to polar mode, which I think is cool. Just leave it at that. You can go in here, you can change the channels. You can go into this module and you can increase and decrease the decay coefficient. So we're actually simulating like a CRT under the hood, where an electron beam hits a screen and it excites a phosphor and then decays over some amount of time. So if you turn this all the way up, then you get no decay. You turn it all the way down, you get literally the tip of the electron ray. You can turn the grid off if you like. It's all pretty configurable. That's this guy right here. Oh, gotta turn the decay back down to get that. You can change the color of the background. Yeah, largely what you would expect. On top of everything you get with just what you'd expect from an oscilloscope, though, you do have access to like the lighting system in the synth and the modulation system, but I'm not going to get into this kind of stuff in too much detail because there's a lot of ground to cover in this video and I don't want to kind of get sidetracked. So this is the basics of this instrument. Far and away the easiest way to get started with CV on the synth. So this is the other oscilloscope on the synth. This is Waviboi, and it's actually pretty significantly different than the other oscilloscope. Instead of just rendering a pair of coordinates, X and Y, like the other one does, this one renders a triplet of coordinates. So it's actually graphing a 3D waveform in space. You can see that a little bit more clearly if you turn on some of this animation right here and start it rotating. So right now, we're actually not rendering any CV controls at all. It's using the internal oscillators, but you definitely can use this perfectly fine with the CV inputs. So this patch right here, it's pretty chaotic, but it's just a demonstration of the fact that you can, start literally rendering 3-dimensional waveforms in space with this thing. So one thing to know, how I actually got this configured, if you're trying to do this yourself, is you go into the waveform, and there are these waveforms. So there's two general waveforms, which we'll get into in a minute, that can be derived from the CV inputs. There's a CV waveform, which kind of makes a one-dimensional waveform from the current value of the CV data, and then there's also the window waveform, which is what I'm using right now. I'm using on the y-coordinate the CV window from channel 1, and the z-coordinates the CV window from channel 2. And what that means is the synth is recording the past, right now it's configured to 200 or 2000 milliseconds. So it's recording the past 2000 milliseconds of CV data, and it's using that to actually render this waveform. So this is kind of crazy, but here, check out this one. So this is also kind of wild, but yeah, so we have gotten rid of the axis, we have black texture in the background, and we have textured the waveform with some like light texture. So yeah, it's responding to the CV inputs. You can make it completely insane. But yeah, so this is a really cool instrument. It starts off on like a really corny like Windows pipe screensaver kind of patch, but I don't know. I think it can get really cool if you actually get in there and configure it. So yeah, this is the second oscilloscope. It is genuinely quite awesome. So it's in polar mode. So it's actually not rendering an XYZ waveform. It's doing like spherical coordinates. And yeah, there's all kinds of ways you can get in here and configure this. Again, you can use the internal LFO oscillator system we have. You get access to the modulation system. So there's just like a ton of stuff you can do. But yeah, so this is the second oscilloscope. All right, so we're back to the init patch for the default fractal instruments, and we're going to start getting into some of the more advanced things you can do. This is still not super advanced, but it's starting to get a little bit more complicated than just literally rendering CD waveforms. So right now I'm going to show you how you can use the CV data to generate textures. So this whole recursion simulation right now, it's being fed by this little square generator that's inside of the seed, and this square generator has a texturing system. So right now we just swap the texture to like an image, but you can literally just graph or put CV data into here. So CV texture black and white. So this is going to be reading from CV channel, I think 1. So there's this little texture system right here, and it's generating a square texture, which we can look at in isolation right here. And this is what it looks like. So this is actually reading from all 8 CV inputs at once. So it's creating a little band from every single CV input. So you get a bunch of information here. So you see I've slowed all the bands down, sped the bands up. And then, yeah, so that just gets integrated into this recursion simulation. And then here I'm literally driving this around. This is definitely kind of basic. It's just to sort of demonstrate how this all can work. But all throughout multiple of these instruments, or many of these instruments, is access to various textures. And you can generate textures from CV data. Here's one that's kind of like that, but more rainbowy. And yeah, these can be used in various places. So let me actually show you something that's cool, as opposed to just a little demo right here. Alright, so check this out. I'm not actually going to get into an in-depth explanation of how I just made this thing, but it's using various CV textures, largely in the modulation system. So you see it kind of slows down, kind of speeds up, and it integrates it in various other ways. So this is crazy stuff. But I think it's pretty great. It's using, I think, all 6 of these CV channels at the moment, and controlling this patch in like numerous ways. So yeah, so there are a couple of texture generators on here. There's some band texture generators. You can also like use a basic oscilloscope as a texture generator here. But yeah, a lot of these instruments have various spots where they kind of read from textures, and there's all kinds of options that can go into the textures. You can generate textures from audio waveforms, from like literal images, from other points in the synth's processing chains. And yeah, like right now what we're doing is we're using the CV values to generate textures, and then it's being fed into the feedback system. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of crazy stuff going on. But that's an example of what you can kind of do with this aspect of the modular control of the synth. All right, so we're gonna start getting a little more technical now, and we're gonna start directly using some of the waveforms that are generated by the CV inputs. So right now we're at the init patch of the cat party instrument, and we're gonna go in here and we're gonna choose a cat, and then we'll choose a party. All right, so just as there are several locations throughout multiple instruments where you can use various textures, you can also use waveforms, which are just like one-dimensional standard waveforms like sine waves, cosine waves. And the most common place where you will see that is in the modulation system, which I'm not going to get into in too great a detail, but I will explain that it basically just lets you generate like auxiliary patterns, and you can map parameters throughout the synth to these patterns. So these patterns, you got 4 of them here, and they're generated based on a shape. So circles, squares, lines, so forth. And then that shape is then put through a waveform. So we have a cosine wave here. That's going to be put through a triangle wave, saw wave. And you can use the waves from the CV data in a couple of different ways. Here's a step wave. I hope you at least sort of get the idea of what I'm doing at the moment. So there are 2 waves that come from the CV input. In general, it's a little more complicated than that, but there's the CV wave. Actually, there's 3 waves. There's the CV window wave, there's a CV wave, and there's the CV multi-wave. So easiest one to understand is CV wave. So this just generates a little bar based on the position of the bar is the value of the CV input, right? And I think this is reading from CV channel 1, so I increase this frequency right here, and the bar moves around a whole lot. All right? CV multi-wave is kind of like that, except it reads from all 8 channels at the same time. This is kind of like the texture that we were using earlier, but it's a little bit different. Then there is CV window wave, which, as I mentioned earlier, the synth is recording the last window, where window means 500 milliseconds, 2000 milliseconds is configurable. So this is recording the last CV data, and then it'll show you that. So this right now is recording the last, I think, 2 seconds of CV data, and it's kind of graphing that in a horizontal fashion. So you basically can use the CV data to generate these modulation patterns, or you can use these CV waveforms in other places in the synth. There's a few other places you can use it too. But you can create these modulation patterns and then use those to modulate parameters. So we'll go in here and play with a second modulation pattern. There's a bunch of waveforms on here, so it can take a while to find the one you want. So CV wave, yeah, there we go. Let's go in here, we'll change the channel. So now it's reading from channel 2. So now we got this LFO. So I think the first pattern is based on this LFO. Second pattern is based on this LFO. And let's just like go in here and move this pattern up there, and then change the frequency, or yeah, whatever. We'll leave it like this. So I think you'll be able to at least kind of get the idea of what I'm getting at here. So then we'll go into the party module, and then there's this control here which turns on this effect, and we'll modulate this parameter by one of these waveforms we just created, or one of these modulation channels we just created. And we do that by going into here and then doing like that. So now CV data waveform is generating a modulation channel, and then that modulation channel is being used to modulate this parameter. Ooh, look at it go. This is just a technical demo right now. I mean, this is all definitely kind of not that impressive, but you at least get the idea of what you can do right here. Let me cut away for a second and try to create something that's actually cool. All right, so this is what I came up with here. I've got these 4 modulation patterns, which are based on the various CV waveforms that we have in the synth. See, this one's controlling the bottom 2, and the other LFOs are controlling the top 2. And then we go, and we can turn off this little preview here. You can see that we've mangled our cat entirely. This is literally one of like a bazillion things you could do with this thing's modular response. You can go in here and you can change out the cat entirely. Instead of starting with the cat, you can start with like the actual CV data. Things just start getting wild pretty rapidly. So one cool thing to know is that the synth actually has a feature which will generate all of these textures and waves for you and automatically integrate them in with any patches you load. So it can be a lot to set up all that stuff. So we've got this thing going on here which is called Automapping, and we're going to turn it on for the Play UI and make sure it's on for CV. And now we go into the Play UI, and if you have CV jacks plugged in, and you have that setting on, you load a patch in here and it will automatically integrate your CV controls into the patch. It does it kind of randomly, so every time you load the patch it's going to be different, but it's a way to get CV interactivity out of the box for pretty much everything on the synth. The synth comes with about 1,000 presets, and I don't think very many of them have CV reactivity built into them, but if you have auto mapping on, anytime you load one of these patches, it's going to automatically integrate your CV controls in with the patch. A little spazzy. Turn the LFOs down. There we go. Yeah, definitely a very, very useful feature to know about getting started with integrating the existing library with modular equipment. All right, so we're going to switch gears here pretty non-trivially. So what we've been doing so far is directly visualizing the CV data via the textures and the waveforms. But another much more technical way of using this information is by directly mapping these CV signals to numerical values in the synth. So all throughout the various instruments and modules on the synth, there's somewhere from 1 to 200 numerical parameters. And what we can do is you can map the incoming CV levels to these various parameters. And how you do that is by going into here and tapping on this little tab right here. And on this page, you see what we call mappings. And we'll demonstrate and get into this just by tapping on new and creating a new one. The basic idea is that a mapping connects a signal to an action. So we have numerous signals on the synth that we can be listening for, whether they're MIDI, CV, audio, etc. But we're focusing on CV at the moment. So when you create a mapping, the synth basically sits there and listens for any of these signals and then executes the action corresponding to the mapping. So actions come in 3 categories. There's value, which basically let you directly control numerical parameters in various ways. And then you can also turn on and off internal LFOs, and then there's system actions, but we'll get into some of this stuff. So the most straightforward thing we can do is go to set value right here and then select a parameter. So because we're in the cat party module, we have access to the parameters from the cat party system. So we'll just go to X offset right here, and then we'll put it on channel 5. All right. Because CV channel 5 is what we have the X-axis of the little joystick hooked up to. So there's a bunch of settings here. There's way too much for me to actually go into. I definitely recommend at this point, if you really want to understand all of this, you either watch one of our tutorial videos or come into our streams or open up the manual. That's probably the best place to understand all of this. But a couple of things I do want to point out. So the CV system is going to output a numerical value from 0 to 1, and that's going to get mapped to the X offset parameter. We want to, in this circumstance, change the range. So instead of outputting a signal from 0 to 1, it's now going to output a signal from -1 to +1. We want to leave everything else the same, but just be aware there is a bunch of stuff you can actually go in here and configure if you want to. And we're going to save this to the patch that we just made. And then we're going to create another one for CV channel 6 and the Y offset parameter. Then we'll go to save new so we don't overwrite that mapping we just created. So now we have 2 mappings, and it should give us the ability to actually move the image around with a joystick. But before I actually show you that, I want to explain a couple more things in here. So again, mappings connect signals to actions. Right now we're looking at signal, CV signal on channel 1, but there's also this little when thing in here, which you probably want to understand a little bit about. So this kind of qualifies when the actual action is triggered. So by default it's at always, but you can have it be changed so the action only triggers when the signal it receives is different than the last signal it received. There's a threshold group right here where the signal is only passed through, where the action is only triggered if the signal is greater than or lower than some value. There's also gate. Gate is probably what you actually want to know a little bit about. So for instance, we'll do rises above and set this value to 0.5. And now this action is only going to be triggered every time the CV value rises above the 0.5 threshold. And now once we have this kind of we have this little condition on here, we get access to some other actions. So now we could, for instance, load a patch every time the CV signal raises beyond some value. So you can basically trigger like more systemic level actions. You can trigger randomizations. You can trigger configuration. All kinds of stuff you can do here. I just kind of wanted to point that out as something to be aware of. So now we have these 2 actions. Now we can go back here and we can start trying to see what we just did. So I'm going to turn some of this stuff off. Go back in here and reload our cat. I'll reset the party too. There you go. Now you can see pretty clearly that I'm moving this around with the joystick. That is because we mapped CV channels 5 and 6 directly up to these 2 numerical parameters here. Probably can't see it in the video, but these parameters right here are actually showing that the values are being changed. And again, I've really just scratched the surface of what you can actually do with this part of the synth. There are literally hundreds of parameters on the synth, and you can control any of them with a wide variety of signals, CV included. If you really want to understand this stuff in detail, I think there's a couple of other videos on our channel about it, and the manual is definitely the go-to place for it. There's also an onboard help system, if you didn't know that, where you can go in here and get information about pretty much everything. So also a good place to go to try to understand this stuff. But yeah, I hope I at least conveyed the general idea that as opposed to directly visualizing graphically the CV data, you can actually utilize the numerical information as well, which is probably what you would first think of when you thought about controlling a synth like this with CV. But yeah, I think that's it. Hopefully I gave you some general idea of what the synth is capable of when it comes to responding to modular gear. Not only does it have multiple oscilloscopes, but you can directly visualize the data, and then you can also use it as a numerical control. Again, I have only really hit the tip of the iceberg with a lot of this information. The video is already long enough as it is, but check out our website, check out our YouTube channel, and again, the ultimate resource for all the information is definitely the manual. We also have a Discord server too where you can go and ask questions if you like. But yeah, thanks for coming by, guys.